The Velthari Dominion had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years, and they had never once failed to conquer a species they targeted. Their method was simple and brutal, and it had worked on 17 different civilizations across 3 spiral arms of the Milky Way. Strike hard before the enemy can prepare, strike fast before they can unite, strike without mercy before they can hope. When their deep space probes detected the radio signals leaking from a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, the Velthari High Council did not waste time on diplomacy or negotiation or any of the softer approaches that weaker species might have considered. They simply ordered the attack. Supreme Commander Vethko assembled his conquest fleet with the casual confidence of a predator who had never known defeat, and he selected 12 of his finest city killer vessels for the mission because preliminary scans showed this species, called humanity, was still primitive and divided into squabbling nations that could barely cooperate long enough to build a space station. The attack came on what the humans called a Tuesday morning. 12 massive warships materialized in Earth's orbit without warning, and their weapons charged with the cold efficiency of machines designed solely for destruction. The first targets were selected based on population density and strategic value. Beijing vanished in a column of white fire that could be seen from space. Moscow followed 4 seconds later. Sao Paulo became a crater of molten glass before its residents even understood what was happening. Chicago burned last, and the Velthari commanders watched their tactical displays with the same bored satisfaction they had felt during every previous conquest. This was always the moment when species broke. This was when the screening started and the leaders began sending desperate messages, begging for terms, and the population collapsed into chaos and despair. The Velthari had seen it happen 17 times before, and they expected nothing different from these primitive humans, but something strange appeared on their sensors. Instead of the expected communications traffic filled with panic and surrender negotiations, the electromagnetic spectrum around Earth suddenly exploded with activity of a very different kind. Military frequencies that had been dormant for decades suddenly came alive. Launch codes were being authenticated across 9 different nations simultaneously. Underground facilities that the Velthari probes had dismissed as geological anomalies began powering up with energy signatures that should have been impossible for a species at this technological level. In a bunker buried deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in a place humans called Colorado, a gray-haired general named Marcus Wright picked up a red phone that connected to systems so classified that only 12 people on Earth knew they existed. He spoke 4 words that would change the course of galactic history. Wake up the swarm. The Velthari had spent considerable resources studying human broadcasts before the attack. They had watched the entertainment programs filled with petty drama and meaningless conflict. They had observed the political divisions that seemed to make cooperation impossible. They had cataloged the wars humans fought against each other over resources and ideology, and sometimes for reasons that made no logical sense at all. They had concluded that this was a species on the verge of destroying itself, and that conquest would be simple because humans could not even agree on basic facts, let alone mount a unified defense. What the Velthari failed to understand was that everything they had observed was not weakness, but practice. Humanity had spent its entire existence at war against nature when ice ages threatened extinction and humans refused to die. War against disease when plague swept across continents and humans developed medicine through sheer, stubborn refusal to accept death. War against each other in conflicts that had refined the art of killing to a science no other species had ever achieved. The Velthari looked at a divided humanity and saw a species that could not cooperate. They should have seen a species that had been preparing for the worst-case scenario for 10,000 years. General Wright watched his displays light up with response signatures from every corner of the globe. The Russians were already launching from silos that satellite surveillance had never detected. Because they were built during the Cold War and never decommissioned, despite what the treaties claimed. The Chinese were activating a railgun network hidden inside what the world thought were hydroelectric dams. The Americans were bringing online systems that Congress had never been told about because some secrets were too important for politicians, and everybody was feeding targeting data to everybody else through encrypted channels that had been established decades ago in preparation for a war that nobody had ever expected to actually fight in orbit. The Valkyrie flagship detected the first wave of missiles rising from Earth's surface, and Commander Vethkal almost laughed at the primitive response. Nuclear weapons were barely effective against shielded vessels, and his point defense systems would intercept most of them before impact. He ordered his weapons officers to continue the bombardment and select the next tier of targets. London and Tokyo and Delhi would burn next, and then surely these stubborn creatures would understand the futility of resistance. But the missiles were not the real attack. The real attack came from the debris field that surrounded Earth like a shell of technological garbage. For decades, humans had been launching satellites into orbit, and many of those satellites had eventually failed and broken apart and added to the growing cloud of junk that made space travel increasingly dangerous. The Valkyrie had scanned this debris and dismissed it as pollution from a careless species. They had not considered that some of that debris was waiting. Project Hornet had been born in the paranoid years of the 2030s when human nations realized that conventional warfare was becoming obsolete, and that the next great conflict would be fought with weapons that could think for themselves. 40 million autonomous drones slept in the darkness between broken satellites. Each drone was no bigger than a human fist each. Drone was solar-powered and patient, and networked to its brothers through quantum entanglement. Cheech. Drone carried a shaped charge capable of cutting through tank armor when the activation signal reached them. They woke up hungry. The Valkyrie vessel, called Dominion's Pride, was the first to die, and it died screaming. 300,000 drones descended on it in a wave of silicon and fury, and they did not waste their charges on the thick hull plating that protected the ship's vital systems. Instead, they targeted joints and sensor clusters and weapon hardpoints and communication arrays. Death by 1,000 cuts delivered at machine speed by weapons that did not know fear or hesitation. Commander Vethkal watched the Pride's icon vanish from his tactical display, and for the first time in his long career, he felt something his species had genetically engineered out of themselves. 12,000 years ago, he felt afraid and down on Earth. In bunkers and basements and converted factories, humanity was just getting started. The second Valkyrie ship died 14 minutes after the first, and it died in almost exactly the same way. The drones came out of the darkness like a cloud of angry metal insects, and they swarmed over the vessel called Conqueror's Blade, and they took it apart piece by piece, while the crew inside screamed into communications channels that were already compromised. Commander Vethkal ordered his remaining ships to pull back from Earth orbit and establish a defensive perimeter at a safer distance, but the drones followed them with patient mechanical persistence. They have been designed to hunt, and they were very good at their purpose. On the bridge of the flagship Eternal Dominion, Vethkal demanded answers from his tactical officers. How had these primitives hidden such weapons from Valkyrie sensors? How had they coordinated such a rapid response when their communications had seemed so disorganized before the attack? How were they fighting back at all when 4 of their largest cities were still burning? His officers had no answers because the truth was something that Valkyrie's strategic doctrine had never accounted for. Humans had always been preparing for war, not war with aliens, because until today, they had not known aliens existed. They had been preparing for war with each other. Every major nation on Earth had spent decades and trillions of currency units building weapons they hoped would never be used. and hiding those weapons from each other, and creating backup systems for backup systems because humans understood something fundamental about the universe that the Valkyrie had forgotten. The universe is not safe, and the only guarantee of survival is being too dangerous to attack. Project Hornet was just one of many insurance policies that humanity had created. There were others in the Atlantic Ocean. A network of submarines that officially did not exist received orders to surface and deploy their payloads. These were not nuclear missiles, although the submarines carried those too. These were communication relay platforms designed to create an unhackable mesh network that would allow human forces to coordinate, even if every satellite in orbit was destroyed. In the mountains of Switzerland, deep beneath facilities that the world thought were physics, research laboratories, automated factories began producing weapons based on designs that had been considered too destabilizing to ever manufacture. Now there was no reason to hold back in bunkers across Russia and China and America and a dozen other nations. Military commanders who had spent their careers planning for wars against each other suddenly found themselves sharing targeting data and tactical assessments with people they had always considered enemies. It was strange and uncomfortable and absolutely necessary. The aliens had made a critical error by attacking everyone at once. If they had attacked only one nation, the others might have hesitated. They might have tried to negotiate or waited to see how the conflict developed, or even secretly hoped that a rival would be weakened. But the Valkyrie had burned cities on every continent and killed people from every nation, and in doing so they had given humanity something it had never achieved on its own: unity through shared hatred. On the ground, the survivors were not waiting for rescue. In the ruins of Beijing, a young woman named Li Wei crawled out of a collapsed building with blood on her face and fire in her heart. She had lost her parents and her brother and her home in the first minutes of the attack, and she had every reason to simply lie down and wait to die. Instead, she started walking toward the nearest military installation. She was not alone. Across the planet, millions of people who had never held a weapon were presenting themselves at recruitment centers and police stations and anywhere they thought they might be given a chance to fight back. The Valkyrie had calculated that destroying major population centers would demoralize the human population and make conquest easier. They had not understood that humans do not become weaker when you hurt them. They become angry. The ham radio operators were the first civilian network to reorganize after the attack. These were people who had spent years building communication systems that did not rely on satellites or cell towers or any centralized infrastructure that could be easily destroyed within hours of the attack. They had established relay chains that connected survivors across continents. Information began flowing through these channels: reports of Valkyrie movements and tactics, instructions for building improvised weapons, locations of supplies and shelters and rally points. The Valkyrie had superior technology, but humans had something else. They had practice at surviving catastrophes. The fishing fleets were next. Thousands of vessels that had been harvesting the oceans for food suddenly became an evacuation armada. Captains who had competed fiercely for the best fishing grounds now coordinated to transport refugees away from coastal cities that might be targeted next. Cargo ships altered their courses to pick up survivors. Private yachts owned by wealthy individuals were volunteered or commandeered, depending on how cooperative their owners were. Flotilla of mismatched vessels began moving people to small islands and remote coastlines where the Valkyrie would hopefully not waste their weapons. And in laboratories around the world, scientists pulled out projects that had been marked too dangerous or too expensive or too ethically questionable, and they asked a new question: what is dangerous now that aliens are trying to exterminate us? Dr. Sarah Chun was working in a university basement in California when the attack began. She had spent 15 years developing experimental drone technology that the military had rejected because the AI was too unpredictable and the weapons too indiscriminate. Now, unpredictable and indiscriminate sounded like exactly what humanity needed. She called her old contacts at DARPA, and found that they were suddenly very interested in talking to her. Similar conversations were happening in research facilities everywhere. Bioweapons programs that had been shut down were being reopened. Directed energy weapons that had been abandoned due to cost overruns were being rushed into production. Cybersecurity experts who had once worked to protect systems were now being asked to attack alien networks. The rules that had constrained human weapons development were being discarded one by one because the stakes had changed. This was no longer about winning a war against other humans. This was about survival. As a species, Commander Vethkal watched his tactical displays and tried to understand what he was seeing. The human resistance should have been collapsing. Instead, it was growing stronger. More weapons were appearing every hour. More coordination was emerging from what had seemed like chaos, and his fleet had already lost 4 ships to those terrible swarming drones that came out of nowhere and would not stop until their targets were dead. He sent a message to the Dominion High Council requesting reinforcements. He had expected to conquer this planet with 12 ships now. He was not sure 1,200 would be enough. The reinforcement fleet arrived 6 weeks after the initial attack, and it was everything. Commander Vethkal had requested a more 40 warships, dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and took up positions around Earth in a formation that had conquered 17 species before humanity's Supreme Commander Vethkal had been promoted after the disastrous opening of the campaign, because the High Council believed that his experience with human tactics would be valuable, even though that experience consisted mainly of watching his ships die in ways that should have been impossible. He looked at the planet below and felt that strange new emotion again, fear. The humans had not been idle during the 6 weeks they had been given to prepare the drone. Swarms that had destroyed his first ships had been upgraded and multiplied, and now they filled Earth's orbital space like a protective shell of angry metal ground-based. Weapons that could reach orbit had been positioned on every continent, and the electromagnetic signatures from the planet's surface suggested that humanity had been building without rest. Since the moment the attack began, the High Council had given Vethkal a simple order: land ground forces and establish control of the planet's surface. The humans could not hide from orbital bombardment forever, and eventually they would have to be conquered the old-fashioned way, with soldiers and occupation and the systematic destruction of any resistance. The first landing force consisted of 10,000 Vulturi warriors in full combat armor supported by armored vehicles and air support. They chose the Australian outback as their landing zone because satellite imagery showed it to be sparsely populated and far from major population centers. It seemed like an ideal location to establish a beachhead and begin the conquest. They were wrong. The humans had been expecting exactly this move for 6 weeks. They had been preparing the outback for visitors. The landing ships touched down on what appeared to be empty desert, and the Vulturi warriors deployed in perfect formation, just as they had been trained. The first sign of trouble came when the ground itself began to explode. The humans had buried thousands of improvised explosive devices beneath the sand, and they detonated them in sequence to create overlapping kill zones that no training could have prepared the Vulturi. 4 warriors who had never known defeat found themselves dying before they could even identify their enemies. The survivors regrouped and advanced toward what their sensors indicated was a small human settlement, but the settlement was a trap. Buildings that looked abandoned were actually fortified position. Streets that seemed empty were covered by interlocking fields of fire, and the humans who defended this place fought in ways that the Vulturi had never encountered before. They did not stand in formation like proper soldiers. They hid behind walls and in holes and on rooftops, and they fired their primitive weapons at any Vulturi who showed themselves, and then they moved to new positions before return fire could find them. When the Vulturi adapted and began using thermal imaging to track human body heat, the humans adapted faster. They started fires everywhere to confuse the sensors. They wore suits that masked their heat signatures. They sent animals running through the streets as decoys. Every time the Velthari found a counter to human tactics. The humans invented new tactics. It was as if they had spent their entire existence preparing for exactly this kind of fight, which, in a way, they had. Vethkal received reports from the front lines, and each one was worse than the last of Velthari sergeant. Described encountering a human female who had been wounded and was missing an arm instead of surrendering or trying to escape. She had used her remaining hand to pull a metal pin from a small explosive device, and then she had embraced the sergeant. They died together and the human had been smiling in. Another report described humans who continued fighting after receiving wounds that should have been instantly fatal. They did not stop until their bodies physically could not move anymore, and even then, some of them kept trying to crawl toward Velthari positions. The warriors wanted to know what kind of creatures they were fighting. Vethkal had no answer. The Dominion had conquered species that surrendered after losing a single city. They had conquered species that fought bravely until their leaders were killed and then collapsed into disorder. Had conquered species that begged for mercy and species that accepted death with dignity and species that tried to negotiate even as they were being destroyed. They had never conquered a species where every single individual seemed to consider death acceptable as long as they could take an enemy with them. The human tactic of acceptable losses was not something the Velthari had ever encountered, because to them losses were never acceptable. The Velthari warrior was expensive to train and equip, and their doctrine emphasized preservation of forces above all else, but the humans seemed to calculate value differently. A farmer with a hunting rifle was not a threat to an armored Velthari warrior unless that farmer was willing to die to get close enough for a shot at a weak point in the armor, and the humans were always willing to die. Ground campaigns stalled within days of beginning Velthari. Forces could take territory, but they could not hold it because the moment they moved on, the humans infiltrated behind them and attacked supply lines and communication posts and anything else that was vulnerable to occupation that should have been routine became a nightmare. Revokal called a meeting of his senior officers to discuss their options. "We must adjust our tactics," he said. "The humans fight differently than any species we have encountered before. They fight like animals." One officer complained, "There is no honor in their methods. There is effectiveness." Vethkal corrected, "And we must learn to counter it or we will lose this war." The idea of losing was so foreign to Velthari, thinking that several officers actually recoiled from the words. But Vethkal had watched 4 ships die in the first day of this campaign, and he had learned something that his culture had forgotten long ago. Sometimes the prey fights back. 6 months into the occupation, the Velthari controlled 30% of Earth's surface, according to their official reports. In reality, they controlled the ground directly beneath their ships, and not a centimeter more. Every base they established became a target. Every patrol they sent out took casualties. Every supply convoy needed armed escort, and even then losses were constant. Humans had turned their entire planet into a killing ground, and they showed no signs of stopping. But the real problem was not the ground war. The real problem was that the humans were learning captured Velthari. Technology was being taken apart in university basements and government laboratories and anywhere else that had the tools to analyze alien equipment. Human hackers had spent months attacking Velthari computer systems, and they had finally cracked the encryption, not through mathematical brilliance or superior algorithms, but through something the Velthari had never anticipated. They had used brute force. Millions of human computers networked together in a distributed attack that simply tried every possible combination until something worked. It was inelegant and wasteful, and it should not have succeeded against Velthari security. But humans did not care about elegance, they cared about results. A 16-year-old student in Seoul named Park Minjun figured out how to spoof Velthari identification signals using modified smartphones. Within Weeks resistance fighters across the planet were using fake IFF codes to move through Velthari-controlled territory undetected. A retired engineer in Germany discovered that Velthari shield generators had a harmonic frequency that could be disrupted by sonic weapons. Human artillery units began using modified speakers to blast specific sound patterns at Velthari positions before attacking. Every weakness in alien technology was found and exploited and shared across human networks that the Velthari could not crack, and in secret locations that not even most human governments knew about. The real counterstrike was being prepared. The Velthari had never considered that humans might hide military assets inside what appeared to be garbage. Its orbit was filled with debris from decades of space activity, dead satellites and spent rocket stages, and fragments of collisions that made a shell of junk. Around the planet, Velthari sensors had cataloged this debris and dismissed it as pollution from a careless species. They had not looked closely enough to notice that some of those dead satellites still had power. Project Lazarus had been created during the Cold War, when human nations feared each other more than any alien threat. The concept was simple: hide weapons in plain sight. 18 orbital platforms, disguised as decommissioned weather satellites, had been waiting for 50 years. They had been upgraded and maintained by crews who were told only that the satellites were strategic reserves. Each platform contained kinetic bombardment systems, not missiles or energy weapons, but something far more primitive and far more devastating: tungsten rods. Each rod was the size of a telephone pole and weighed several thousand kilograms. When dropped from orbit, they would accelerate to incredible speeds. Before impact, no explosives were needed. The kinetic energy alone would create destruction comparable to a nuclear weapon without any radiation. The humans called it rods from God. The activation signal came from a submarine that had been running silent in the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean since the day the invasion began. Its captain had orders to wait for exactly the right moment. 6 months of watching Velthari ship movements had revealed patterns. The aliens rotated their vessels for maintenance on a predictable schedule. On this particular day, 7 of their largest warships were clustered together for resupply. The captain sent the signal in orbit. The Lazarus platforms dropped their disguises and revealed what they truly were. First tungsten rod began its descent at 0347 hours local time, struck the Velthari flagship Eternal Dominion at a velocity that human mathematics could barely calculate. The ship did not explode, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was the largest warship in the Velthari fleet. The next moment, it was an expanding cloud of debris. 6 more ships died in the next 4 minutes as rods fell from the sky like the judgment of an angry god. The Velthari called it the hammer of a mad species. Commander Vethkal survived because his ship had been on patrol duty away from the resupply point. He watched 11 of his remaining vessels take critical damage from attacks they never saw coming, and he realized that the invasion was over. Not because the Velthari had won, because they had lost. The ground forces were suddenly cut off from orbital support, and they found themselves surrounded by a human population that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The hunting parties went out that night. All across Earth, humans who had been hiding and waiting and planning took up their weapons and went looking for Velthari soldiers. There was no coordination. There did not need to be. Every human knew what to do. The alien patrols that had terrorized occupied territories became the targets. The bases that had seemed impregnable became traps. The warriors who had never known defeat learned what it felt like to be Pravthitkal, ordered a retreat to defensible positions. But there were no defensible positions. The humans were everywhere. They came out of buildings that sensors said were empty. They rose up from underground tunnels that Velthari maps did not show. They attacked from angles that should have been impossible, with weapons that should not have existed. They did not stop, not when the sun rose, not when Velthari Reinforcements tried to break through, not ever the message. The call sent to the High Council was simple. We cannot hold this planet. We cannot defeat these creatures. Recommend immediate withdrawal. Before total loss of expedition forces. It was the first time in 12,000 years that a Veltari commander had recommended retreat. The High Council did not know how to respond. Supreme Commander Vethkol died on Earth, but not in battle. That would have been honorable. He died in a basement in what the humans called Detroit, trying to negotiate a surrender that his superiors in the High Council refused to authorize. The Veltari had never surrendered to a conquered species. They did not know how, but Vethkal had watched his forces die for 6 months, and he had learned something his culture had forgotten. Long ago, sometimes you cannot win. He had arranged a secret meeting with human commanders through channels that neither side fully trusted. The location was a ruined building in a city that had been fought over so many times that nothing remained standing. Above the second floor, Kal came with 2 guards. The humans came with 20 soldiers, and a woman who introduced herself as Commander Sarah Chun. She was small by human standards, with dark hair and eyes that had seen too much death. Vethkal recognized something in those eyes. He had seen it in his own reflection. You wish to discuss terms, Chun said. I wish to end this war, Vethkal replied. My people have never been defeated before, and they do not know how to accept defeat now. But I have seen what your species is capable of, and I know that we cannot win. Chun studied him for a long moment. Your High Council refused your request to withdraw. They believe that reinforcements will change the outcome. Will they? Vethkal thought about all the battles he had witnessed and all the impossible things the humans had done, and all the warriors he had lost to creatures that should have been easy to conquer. No, he admitted, more ships will simply mean more losses. Chun nodded slowly. Then why are you here if you cannot offer surrender? Because I want you to understand something, Vethkal said. The Dominion will not stop sending ships until they understand what they are facing, and they will not understand unless someone tells them. So tell them. They will not listen to me. Vethkal said, I have failed, and failure is not forgiven in our culture, but they might listen if they heard it from you. He activated a communication device, and Chun realized that this meeting was being broadcast to the Veltari High Council. In real time, she had prepared for a negotiation. Instead, she had been given a stage. Your Dominion needs to understand something, Chun said, looking directly at the device. You attacked us because you thought we were young and weak and divided. She smiled, and Vethkal understood in that moment why some ancient Veltari texts spoke of demons. We have been fighting since before we climbed down from the trees. Chun continued. Every nation you observed before your attack was built on the graves of the nations that came before it, and every city you destroyed had already been burned and rebuilt a dozen times throughout our history. We do not unite despite our divisions. We unite because of them, because we know exactly what we are capable of doing to each other, and we decided to do it to you instead. She leaned closer to the device. Go home. Tell your Dominion what you found here. Tell them that humanity will reach the stars, and when we do, we are going to remember who attacked first. We are going to remember the 60 million people you killed in your opening strike, and we are going to find you. The transmission ended. Vethkal looked at the human commander and knew that he would not leave this basement alive. He was correct. The surviving Veltari vessels fled 3 days later. They left behind their dead and their damaged technology and their pride. They left behind a species that had tasted alien blood and found it satisfying. The High Council debated what to do for months. Some wanted to send a larger fleet and finish what they had started. Others pointed out that humanity had captured Veltari technology and was already reverse engineering it. By the time a second invasion force could be assembled, humans might have weapons that could threaten the Dominion itself. In the end, fear won over pride. The Sol system was designated a no-entry zone. Warning beacons were placed at the edge of human Space broadcasting in every known language, a simple message. The species called humanity is to be considered existentially dangerous. Do not engage. Do not provoke. Do not underestimate. Avoid at all costs. 18 months after first contact, the United Earth Defense Council held its inaugural session. Representatives from every nation sat in the same room. Some of these nations were still technically at war with each other from conflicts that had been frozen when the aliens arrived. But they all agreed on one thing: humanity would never be caught unprepared again. Factories that had produced weapons during the invasion did not stop production after the Velthari left. They expanded the research programs that had developed new technologies. Did not shut down. They accelerated the unity that had been forged in desperation, did not dissolve when the threat departed it. Deepened, and in a shipyard, hidden inside an asteroid that humans had quietly claimed for their own engineers, worked on the first human vessel capable of faster-than-light travel. It was not designed for exploration. It was designed for war. Hull was thick and armored with materials reverse-engineered from captured Velthari technology. The weapon systems were human designs, improved with alien principles. The crew was selected from volunteers who had fought in the occupation and who remembered what it felt like to watch their cities. MERM Commander Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the vessel they had named Retribution, and she looked at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Velthari Dominion waited. They had attacked humanity because they thought humans were weak. They had learned otherwise. Now humanity was coming to return the lesson. The first human FTL ship departed Earth orbit on the second anniversary of the initial attack. Its mission was officially classified as reconnaissance. Everyone knew what it really was: a warning. The aliens had attacked first, but they were not ready for what came next, and neither was the rest of the galaxy. And